Good morning, my name is Jacqueline Sabal and I'll be presenting the gross domestic product for the first quarter of 2021. The order of my presentation is as follows. I will highlight the production within the first quarter of 2021 and then go further in detail about the industries within the primary, the secondary, and finally the tertiary sector. First, we'll start with a definition of what exactly the gross domestic product is. GDP is defined as the total value of all finished goods and services produced within an economy in a given period. GDP is used as the main indicator of economic activity within a country. GDP estimates are produced based on information received from financial statements, production information from the government, private businesses, as well as non-government organizations. To determine the country's GDP, we assess three productive sectors of the economy. The primary sector, which includes raw materials that can be processed into a finished good. These are products of agriculture, fisheries, forestry, mining, etc. The secondary sector, this includes industries that takes the raw materials produced by the primary and processes them into manufactured goods. And lastly, the tertiary sector, which includes the production of services instead of an end product. For example, hotels providing accommodation services. Before we get into the results of the first quarter GDP for 2021, which will be compared against the first quarter of 2020, it is important to note that the first quarter of 2020 was fairly normal up until around the end of March, in terms of when we began to see the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. With that said, this is now the country's fourth consecutive quarter reflecting the impact of the pandemic. For the first quarter months of January to March 2021, Belize produced goods and services totaling $660 million. This represents a decrease of $60.4 million or 8.4% when compared to the first quarter of 2020. If we observe what each sector contributed to the overall GDP during the months of January to March over the past years, the sector whose movements make the most impact is the tertiary sector. Tertiary sector contributions have exceeded 50% of GDP from 2015 and has increased steadily up until 2021, where the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic took effect more severely within the services sector than in the primary and the secondary. The sector with the second largest contribution is usually the secondary sector, ranging around 14 to 15% of GDP, and then the primary sector at roughly 10 to 11%. Looking specifically at the overall first quarter GDP at constant prices over a 7-year period, the graph highlights fluctuations in the GDP from 2016 to 2021. The latest 8.4% decline in production in the year 2021, which also reflects the largest first quarter decrease to date, was mainly due to decreases within the tertiary sector. Next, we'll highlight the production in each sector, starting with the primary. Within the primary sector, output decreased to $76.8 million during the first quarter of 2021. This represents a decline of 2% or $1.6 million when compared to the first quarter of 2020. The agriculture, hunting, and forestry industry contracted by 0.8% or $0.6 million, totaling $72.2 million. The fishing industry also decreased by 17.6% during the quarter as marine exports dropped by $1 million, bringing this industry total to $4.6 million. In the case of banana production, extended rainy weather conditions contributed to a 16.9% decrease in banana output, from 26.2 thousand metric tons produced in the first quarter of 2020 to 21.8 thousand metric tons produced in the first quarter of 2021. As it relates to citrus, over the years, citrus fruit production has decreased steadily during the first quarter. Even more so in 2021, the low yield was due to the combined effects of citrus greening that continues to affect the more mature trees, and the late crop that was harvested last year, ultimately contributing to the shortfall in this year's crop. 35,000 metric tons of citrus fruit was harvested in 2021 compared to 59.7 thousand metric tons in 2020. Despite an overall decline within the agricultural sector, the sugarcane industry began to rebound from the effects of the extended dry season that devastated production in 2020. Optimal weather conditions required for crop health and growth, along with on-time maintenance during the first quarter, resulted in deliveries of 760.6 thousand metric tons of sugarcane. This reflects an increase of 26.2% compared to 2020, when 602.9 thousand metric tons was produced. Now looking at the livestock industry. Overall, production increased by 8.3%. Cattle and pig production both increased by 61% and 1.6% respectively, while poultry production decreased by 13%. Going through each variety individually. First, we'll start with cattle production. Due to the buildup in stock from previous border closures, combined with a larger mothering herd during the period, a considerable increase in exported cattle contributed to a 61% overall rise in cattle production, from 10,200 heads produced in Q1 of 2020 to 16,500 heads produced in 2021. In terms of pig production, a rise in pigs heading to the local market aided in a 1.6% increase in production, from 8,700 heads produced during the first quarter of 2020 to 8,800 heads in 2021. Poultry producers experienced a 13% decrease in production, the result of continued restrictions on restaurants and the lack of tourist visitors to the country. In total, 9.7 million pounds of birds were slaughtered in the first quarter of 2021, compared to 11.1 million pounds slaughtered during the same period in 2020. Now moving to the fishing industry. This industry declined by 17.6% during the first quarter, as exported shrimp and lobster meat declined by 58.4% and 34.9% respectively. On the other hand, exported lobster tail increased by 10.1% and exported conch grew 14.1%. The secondary sector was the only sector to experience growth during the first quarter of 2021. Overall, production within secondary industries increased by 4.3%, bringing the total for this industry up to $103.7 million. The driving factor in this increase was the electricity and water industry, which grew by 24.5% or $5.5 million, bringing that industry total to $28 million. Construction activities increased by 15.7% or $3.9 million, evidenced by an increase in loans for building and construction, coupled with a rise in cement imports. However, the manufacturing and mining industry decreased by 9.8% or $5.1 million, bringing this industry total to $47 million. During the months of January to March, the electricity and water industry grew by 24.5%. Electricity generation alone recorded a 34.6% increase in production, while water consumed during the quarter decreased by 7.5%. Higher water levels at the Chaleo Dam during the earlier months of the year resulted in a 34.6% increase in electricity production. Production grew from 53.2 thousand megawatt hours produced in 2020 to 71.6 thousand megawatt hours produced in 2021. In terms of water consumption, a rise in the rainy weather conditions, coupled with an increase in disconnections made during the quarter, resulted in a 7.5% decrease, from 667.2 millions of gallons consumed in 2020 to 617.4 millions of gallons in 2021. Within the manufacturing and mining industry, beverage production continued to suffer from the lack of tourist visitors and the restrictions placed on restaurants and bars. However, not as severely as in previous quarters of the pandemic. Production declined marginally by 0.2% in 2021 compared to 2020. Soft drink production decreased by 0.8%, while beer production increased by 0.2%. Soft drink production recorded a slight 0.8% decrease in output, from 1,721 thousands of gallons produced in 2020 to 1,706.5 thousands of gallons produced in 2021. On the other hand, beer production was boosted by the introduction of pirate beer into the Belizean market in January of 2021. A total of 711.1 thousands of gallons of beer was produced in quarter 1 of 2021 compared to 709.6 thousands of gallons produced in the same quarter of 2020. Petroleum extraction for the first quarter months decreased by 35.5%, as approximately 22,000 less barrels were extracted from reservoirs in 2021 compared to 2020. And despite an overall decrease in the manufacturing and mining industry, increased sugarcane deliveries aided in a rise in sugar production by 28.3%. 55.3 thousand metric tons of sugar was produced during quarter 1 of 2020 compared to 2021 when 71,000 metric tons was produced. Also attributed to deliveries, citrus concentrate production decreased significantly by 44.4%, from 1,194.4 thousands of gallons produced in quarter 1 of 2020 to 663.6 thousands of gallons produced in 2021. The sector most severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, the tertiary sector, continued to record the largest decrease among all sectors, with a significant 12.3% drop or $54.7 million decrease across all tertiary industries, bringing this industry total down to $390.3 million. Within this sector, the wholesale and retail trade subsector contracted by 7.3%, as less machine and transport equipment, oils and fats, mineral fuels and lubricants, and crude materials were imported into the country. The hotel and restaurants industry declined considerably by 81.7%, bringing the total for that industry to $6.2 million. The transport and communication subsector totaled $54 million, representing a decrease of 14.3% during the quarter, while producers of government services also decreased by 4.6% or $4 million observed through the decline in government salaries. Now we'll look closer at the hotels and restaurants industry. Activities within the hotels and restaurants subsector remained insubstantial compared to the previous years. With no cruise ships during the quarter, overnight tourist arrivals alone declined by 75.4%, from approximately 123,000 visitors in quarter 1 of 2020 to roughly 30,000 visitors in 2021. And just to recap, for the first quarter of 2021, GDP decreased by 8.4% compared to the same period of 2020. Production across the primary sector decreased by 2%, the secondary sector grew by 4.3%, while the tertiary sector decreased by 12.3%.